Hey guys, Fox here, and today we're going to be doing my week one review of the 2023 USFL season. Just like last year, we're going to be looking at each game more in depth than we will in the power rankings and all that. And then we're also going to combine the player of the week this time, and we're going to talk about the attendance and TV ratings. So without further ado, let's get started with looking at the scores of the games. The Stars ended up beating the Showboats at Memphis 27-23. The Stallions beat the Generals 27-10. Panthers beat the Gamblers 29-13 and the Breakers beat the Maulers 22-15. Overall, all these games were pretty good for at least a half, and then the Breakers and Stars games were also just incredible the whole time. As for the Stars Showboats game, that game ended up being a lot closer than some people might think it was going to be, but a lot of that was due to miscues as well as penalties. The Stars had a lot of penalties that ended up hurting them, but what really hurt either team was the Showboats' miscues. An interception on their first drive and a missed field goal in one of their first drives of the second quarter. Those two things ended up being huge for them. If those two things don't happen, this game could be a lot different, especially because the Showboats ended up missing a PAT near the end of the game, where if they make that game is literally within three, and if they had made the field goal earlier, this game would have been a lot closer. So essentially, the Showboats did end up losing this game, but it was a very close game. It was overall a really fun one. And then we have the Generals versus Stallions. This game was definitely wild in the first half. The Generals are off their first drive, they fumble the ball, and the Stallions get it. And on their first play, Jamar throws a 61-yard touchdown pass to Watkins for just an incredible touchdown. And then there was a few punts for the rest of the quarter until the Generals ended up scoring a touchdown in the second. The Stallions would get a field goal, and then you had a couple more miscues, turnover on downs, a pick, field goal, and all that. And then at the end of the half, the Stallions scored a touchdown. And after they scored that touchdown to go up 17-10, the game ended up being over. The Generals would always get close, but it never felt they got close enough where they go to a turnover on downs at a short fourth down attempt or it'd be a fumble. They ended up having 3 turnover on downs in the fourth quarter, which ended up ending them. As for the Panthers and the Gamblers game, there's only really two things you need to know about this game. That's the total yardage, yards per play, and then the turnovers. The Panthers, as you can see, had a way better yards. They had over 100 more total yards than the Gamblers, and the yards per play was an insane 2.4 higher than the Gamblers. And then in turnovers, they fumbled once or lost one fumble, whereas the Gamblers lost 2 fumbles and threw 2 interceptions. The turnovers and the yard and the efficiency on offense proved to be the difference in this game for the Panthers to get the win. And then last was the Maulers versus the Breakers. This was a very interesting game because it felt like this was a very slow-moving type of battle. Neither team really looked far better than the other, despite the fact the Breakers held the ball way longer than the Maulers did. What ended up being the difference in this game was really the not great quarterback play the Maulers had, as if you compare McCloy Bethel Thompson to the Morgan Williams show that was the Maulers, it's very clear they had worse quarterback play, and then it was also the fact of just special teams. Whereas there were a couple miscues on the Mauler special teams, allowing blocked kicks and missing PATs and stuff like that. That wasn't the case for the Breakers. The Breakers made every single field goal, and that ended up being the huge deal for them. I mean, there was a punt return touchdown by the Maulers late in the game, and that ended up being really helpful for them. And if it wasn't for that punt return touchdown, they could have lost by a lot more. But Hirelily missed his extra point, and that ended up costing him at the end, as well as the missed kick earlier. So yeah, overall the 4 games were all pretty solid. Definitely really good ones to watch for the most part. As for players of the week, we'll start with the special teams player of the week since we're already talking about the Breakers and Matt Conklin. Conklin ended up going 5 for 5 in field goals for 100% accuracy, making one from 51 yards, and he also made his only extra point to score 16 total points out of their 22. Put it simply, if it wasn't for him, the Breakers don't win this game. If they have a kicker who only makes, 3 of those 5 kicks or something, they're in a completely different situation. He did great for them, and he definitely deserved to win Special Teams Player of the Week. Now, in terms of Offensive Player of the Week, we go to the Panthers with Josh Love. Love ended up going for a 90 completion percentage, 18-20, which is a USFL record. That's from the old and new USFL. He ended up having 215 yards. He averaged 10.8 yards per attempt. He had 3 touchdowns to 0 interceptions, and he had a 151 quarterback rating, getting close to that illustrious perfect game. He had an incredible game and definitely deserved to win the award. He didn't fumble the ball. He didn't really do anything on the ground, but he did what he needed to do through the air, which is the main job of a quarterback. He definitely deserved the award. And then last is Defensive Player of the Week. This went to Breland Speaks, the former second rounder from Kansas City, the Chiefs. where he ended up having 7 tackles, which is tied for the team lead. And he also tied for team lead in solo tackles at 4. So he did great tackling. And then he had 3 sacks. Yeah, he had a hat trick of sacks and 2 TFLs and a forced fumble. To put it simply, Speaks was incredible. And at least through 1 week, it looks like we might have another Chris Odom on our hands, a guy that's just insanely dominant from the edge. He had a great game, and he definitely deserved to win the award. So congratulations to those 3 guys for winning Players of the Week. And now in terms of the attendance. Now the attendance figures are not official. We don't have official numbers. Just like last year, the USFL and the stadiums agreements isn't to release those. That's mainly due to the non-home team games, which everyone knows doesn't have great attendance. But we can speculate and see what news sources say and stuff like that. Which is why the Memphis Showboats game, it's pretty clear they got probably about 20,000-ish people. If they got over 15, under 25,000 basically, they got about 20-ish thousand people, which is a really solid turnout for that game. That game ended up having a lot of ticket sales. They expanded different, seating areas. And with their good showing against the Stars, they're able to also have a great showing. If not beat the Stallions this week, we could see them have even more fans in their next game, which is a great thing. And just like with the XFL, I'm going to be comparing their home teams, if I can, to a previous home team. So comparing them to the Memphis Express is how we can see they probably had about 20,000. Well, the Express had fans on both sides of the field. It was very clear they didn't have many on either side of the field, and they ended up averaging just under 13,000 fans per game, never topping 14,000. So even if we were mean to the Showboats and say they had only 16,000 fans, they still would beat the Express by 3,000 and beat their top game by over 2,000. Safe to say the Showboats definitely did far better than the last Memphis team that was here. I think, as I said, if you compare, pictures and stuff like that, it looks like the Showboats had a really great crowd compared to the Express, so that's a good thing. As for the Stallions are a bit disappointing. Just like I've said for a couple of the XFL teams, sometimes disappointing doesn't mean you necessarily failed. It's just you didn't do as good as you really should have. The Stallions last year had about 17,000 fans at their opening game. This year was probably more like 15,000, which is still decent. It's still technically better than the Birmingham Iron in the AAF's total average of 14,000. But that number is a bit of needs a bit of context, because that 14,000 number is only there because they had one game where they only had 6,500 people, whereas every other game had either 13,000 or 17,000. So their average should be about like 15,500, 16, because they had 3 games with over 17,000 people. So it's a bit disappointing to see the defending champions not have that great of attendance, but it's not like it was horde. It's just like the Arlington Renegades. It's not horde attendance. It's just disappointing. Now, in terms of TV ratings, this is naturally where we have, to actually look at how good they did on TV against the XFL and the NBA playoffs naturally. And I think that this ended up being sort of good for both leagues. Neither league is going to look at this and go like, yeah, we had great ratings, but neither of them are going to look at it and go, oh man, this is bad. The Philly-Memphis game ended up having 837,000 people watching. The Birmingham-New Jersey game at 864,000. The Michigan-Houston game was the top of both leagues at 974,000. And then the New Orleans-Pittsburgh game on FS1 had 483,000. Overall, solid numbers. You had over 800,000 on all 3 broadcast games. And it's just like I said, the XFL, there's always going to be some sort of sporting event, but just like the XFL had a huge hindrance with March Madness, the NBA playoffs were happening, and they ended up being like the most watched playoffs in like 10 years for the first round. So there is a bit of understanding why the XFL and USFL ratings are a bit down, especially since you consider the fact that for the XFL, there are 4 games. Their one on broadcast at 878,000 people, the second most watched game. Their ESPN2 game was the most disappointing of either league at 235,000. Then their DC Arlington at 670,000 and St. Louis Seattle at 570,000. Now, it's also important to note that some of these games did compete with each other. The Orlando San Antonio game competed with the Stallions game and ended up getting crushed. And then the DC Arlington game competed with the Michigan Panthers Houston game. And this is the one that a lot of people are looking at and actually saying is a great thing for both leagues. This is saying that if there was only one spring game and you were to combine the viewers, let's just say we take out 100,000 for the XFL game and combine them, you're still having over 1.4 million people watching a spring football game at the same time. So there is a good market for this. It's just that when you had 2 leagues competing for a lot of the same eyes, it did hurt. So that is important to know. So in terms of the opening weekend, neither league is going to look at this and say, oh man, this is incredible, but neither of them are going to look at this and say it's terrible. The Fox game at night, while some people may say 837,000 is terrible on Fox, similar primetime games from what I understand, MLS, Next Level Chef, other prime shows around this time, actually do about the same, if not worse than this. So it's not horrid. Yeah, they do have times that are better, but for all intents and purposes, this wasn't terrible for them, especially when you're competing head on with the NBA playoffs, which everyone knew was going to be a bigger hindrance than most other sporting events, just like March Madness. So that is an important caveat to know for both leagues. But I digress. So overall, the numbers were pretty solid. They beat their competition, though. Like we said before, they were expected to because they were on broadcast going against cable. So, and I think that the biggest number to take away is that is the FS1 game at over 483,000. If I'm not mistaken, this is literally the most viewed, or the second to most viewed FS1 game since the USFL, came back last year, as they only had like one game do better than this, and every other game was a lot worse. So if they can keep that number above 400,000 in FS1, it's going to be a huge win for the league. And this week we're going to have our first USA game of the year. So we'll see. Overall, this has been Zomfox. If you enjoy this content and want to be subscribed to see more, make sure to subscribe and hit the bell. I do videos all the time for the USFL naturally, and we're going to have at least 3 videos a week for the whole USFL season. So as always, have a great night.